But what if they just want to marry a Jewish person or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, someone who's non-baptized? Could the Catholic marry that individual in the Catholic Church? Every so often, I'm asked if a Catholic may marry a non-Catholic, and if so, under what conditions. So today, on this episode, we'll take a look at the conditions for making a valid marriage in the Catholic Church, and on a wider lens and view, what constitutes marriage in the Church as we as Catholics understand it. My name is Father Jerome Magat, and I'm the Vice Rector and a Professor of Moral Theology at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. If you like our channel and the content we provide, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share. Today we're going to look at the question, can a Catholic marry a non-Catholic? In general, the answer is yes. However, it's not as straightforward as some people might think. So in order to contextualize the question, it's helpful to understand an important distinction between what makes a valid marriage and a sacramental marriage. These two are related but different. So let's start with sacramental marriage. As Catholics, we celebrate marriage as one of the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. In this particular scenario, we are looking at a man who is otherwise not impeded or prevented from marrying a woman who is likewise not impeded or prevented from marrying that man. So when a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, one of the first facts that needs to be established is whether or not the intended spouse of the Catholic is baptized. If the non-Catholic spouse, they could be Protestant, they could be Orthodox, as long as they are a baptized Christian, and here what I mean by baptized, to be clear, is someone who's been baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit while having water poured over their head or immersed into waters. As long as the person that the Catholic is intending to marry is baptized, that marriage, all things being equal, would be a sacramental marriage and also valid. So in sum, in order for a sacramental marriage to occur, both parties, both spouses, need to be baptized. And of course, here I'm assuming that if either person has had prior marriages, those marriages have been reviewed and looked at, sometimes through what's known as the annulment process, but that's a different topic for a different day. But what if they just want to marry a Jewish person or a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, someone who's non-baptized? Could the Catholic marry that individual in the Catholic Church? The answer would also be yes, but the marriage would not be a sacrament, but it would still be valid. And that's very important because as long as the marriage is valid, the Catholic is continued to be allowed to participate in all the other sacraments of the Church that they're eligible for, namely, in practical terms, going to communion and going to confession. So in those particular cases, when a Catholic marries a non-baptized person, they have to go through a process called pre-cana, which is marriage preparation classes, usually with a priest or a deacon or some other appointed layperson in a parish who will help them prepare to understand the Catholic notion of marriage, what marriage means, what it requires, what someone has to intend in order to enter into a marriage validly. I should mention that even if a Catholic is marrying a fellow Christian, a Protestant or an Orthodox, a non-Catholic Christian, pre-cana also happens. It's just taken on a different track, but essentially the content of the preparation is quite similar, if not identical. From the Catholic's point of view, when they approach their local priest or just say their local parish for marriage preparation, in addition to reviewing the couple's history, whether individuals who are going to be parties to this new bond have been married before, the priest or the deacon has to appeal to the local bishop for certain dispensations or permissions in order for that marriage to occur in a Catholic ceremony. If the ceremony is going to be taking place not in a Catholic church building and not even in a Catholic ceremony, a Catholic may still enter into that marriage. I'll give you an example. Jack is Catholic and Jill is Lutheran. Jill's father is a Lutheran minister. And from the time she was 12, she always imagined that her father, the Lutheran minister, would witness her wedding vows. Her brother would give her away, and her dad would be the one to witness her vows. And she meets Jack, a Catholic, who says, I have to be married in the church. Well, believe it or not, Jack and Jill can actually be married in a Lutheran ceremony as long as Jack and Jill have done their marriage preparation in the church and they have received all of the proper permissions and dispensations that are necessary in order to be married in a Lutheran ceremony. Again, the marriage would be valid. Jill does not necessarily have to become Catholic. And if Jack were marrying a different woman named Jane and she was Buddhist, Jane would not have to become Catholic either. So you see, there's quite a bit of flexibility for Catholics to marry non-Catholics. It's quite possible. And again, here I'm assuming that both parties, Jack and Jill, or Jack and the potential Buddhist wife, are free to marry, meaning they have no prior marriages or prior bonds that have not been looked at, often through what's called the annulment process. So that in general answers the question, may a Catholic marry a non-Catholic? In the most simple of terms, the answer is yes, provided, of course, they meet the different requirements that I've just presented. Now, that, of course, begs a more fundamental question about the meaning and nature of marriage in the Catholic Church, what we as Catholics believe marriage to be. The couple needs to have essentially three things. The first is a capacity to be married. In other words, are they of age to marry? The Code of Canon Law, which is the law of the church, stipulates that in general, a man has to be at least 16 and a woman needs to be at least 14. Now, I know in Western society, that might seem a little young, but remember that the code is written for the universal church. There may be cultures where those ages might still be appropriate or possible. They also have to have the mental capacity to understand what they're entering into when they go into a marriage. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a sec. They also have to be able to freely choose to enter into the bond. We call this free consent. No one can be pressuring them to marry. No one can be forcing them to marry. They have to freely enter into the bond. And the last thing that they need to do is that they need to have what's called canonical form, which is basically the correct ceremony or the correct minister witnessing their vows. And again, there's a wide disparity in what that could be. Again, I already presented Jack and Jill's father's a Lutheran minister, remember. That's possible. So remember the three C's: capacity, consent, and canonical form. Lastly, and most importantly, both spouses need to intend three things when they enter into a marriage. The first is permanence. That means what you might think it means, that they intend to be married once for the rest of their lives. If one of the spouses was to be deceased, was to die, that would free the surviving spouse to remarry. They would be free to marry because the bonds, the promises of marriage end at death. So permanence is relatively easy for most people to understand, as is the second condition, fidelity. That means no cheating on your spouse. That's a very, very simple thing for most people to understand. But the third one is a little bit more difficult these days for many couples to understand, and that is an openness to children. God has established marriage as the relationship between a man and a woman where future generations are brought into existence and raised in Christian faith. So a couple cannot enter into marriage preparation with a prior bias or decision against having children. Now, I want to be very clear about this because this can be a moment of confusion. A couple may experience infertility. Either the man or the woman are unable to have children. That is not an impediment to a valid or sacramental marriage in the Catholic Church. However, impotency is. And impotency, in the simplest terms, is the inability of one or both spouses to complete the marital act. If the couple cannot complete the marital act, they cannot be validly married in the Catholic Church. But let's go back to the more fundamental question. An a priori or a prior bias or decision against having children. So often in my experience of preparing couples for marriage, I've had couples come in and say, if we have children, and I like to press them on what that if means. If meaning as long as God gives them the physical capacities to do so, or that they're going to be able to physically bring children into the world. That's a very different if than if the couple says, we don't think we want to have kids at all, even if we have the capacity to do so. That's a very different kind of approach to the question of children. So when a couple comes in for marriage preparation and they have any of these impediments or blocks to contracting a valid marriage in the Catholic Church, those issues need to be resolved prior to the couple approaching the altar to make their marriage promises. So in sum, Catholics can marry non-Catholics, usually not a problem. But this has to be looked at in closer detail, to which I invite you to talk to your local parish priest or deacon to get a little bit more clarity on the specifics of your situation. If you like this video, please feel free to look at some of our other selections found in the overhead area here. Click on those links. And again, thank you for listening, and God bless.